The sun was starting to set, casting an orange hue across the bustling city streets. It was just another ordinary day for Elena, but to her, it felt like everything was collapsing at once. With bills piling up and dreams of a better life slipping further away, she was tired. Tired of the struggle, tired of pretending that everything was going to be okay. Walking briskly to her next job, a small part of her mind wondered if this was all there was to life. Late nights, minimum wage jobs, and an endless loop of work without reward. It was on that rainy evening that fate intervened. She had barely managed to catch the last cab of the day, a beat-up taxi with dim lights and a worn interior. The driver, a man she didn't give a second glance to, was dressed simply, a far cry from the flashy personalities she was used to encountering. His eyes, however, spoke volumes. They were calm and collected, almost as if he had seen the world in ways she never could. She slumped into the back seat, sighing as the tiredness weighed down on her. "Where to?" His voice was deep and steady, but there was a quiet confidence in it. Elena gave him the address, a familiar route she had taken countless times. She didn't expect anything to change tonight, nothing different at all. But as the cab pulled away from the curb, something strange stirred in the air. There was an odd sense of anticipation, as though the world around her was holding its breath. She barely noticed it at first, how he took a detour. Maybe she had just been too tired to notice the small turns and twists, but it wasn't until they were far from her usual path that she started feeling uneasy. Excuse me," she said, sitting up straighter. "This isn't the usual way to my place." The driver didn't respond immediately, and she found herself staring at the back of his head. It was a little odd, but she didn't press further. She had no reason to believe there was anything sinister. And then, the car slowed to a stop. They were no longer surrounded by the familiar city streets. They were at the edge of something different. The streetlights here were dim, casting long shadows on the ground. Ahead, an open space stretched before her. A private dock, a yacht shining under the soft lights, almost like something out of a dream. Elena's heart skipped a beat. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She had expected him to laugh or make a joke, but instead, he turned toward her, meeting her gaze for the first time since she had entered the cab. "I thought you might like a change of scenery." His words were simple, but they sent a ripple of confusion through her. This wasn't just some random taxi driver. This wasn't a regular man at all. Her instincts screamed that she should be cautious, but a strange curiosity tugged at her. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked, half laughing to mask her nervousness. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply opened the door and stepped out, walking toward the yacht. Elena sat frozen for a moment, her heart thumping wildly. What was happening? This was insane. She didn't know what to make of any of it. And yet, something deep inside urged her to follow, so she did. Stepping out of the car, she felt a cool breeze on her skin as she slowly approached the man. The closer she got to the yacht, the more surreal the whole thing felt. It was luxurious, yes, but not in the flashy, superficial way that she had seen with rich people. This was understated and elegant, a beautiful world she had never imagined. The man, noticing her hesitance, turned back to her and spoke again, his voice softer. "You don't have to be afraid. I don't bite." Elena tried to laugh, but it sounded hollow even to her ears. She was torn. Part of her wanted to run, to forget this whole encounter. But another part of her felt drawn to him, intrigued by the mystery. Who was he? What was he doing here? She had already judged him as nothing more than a poor taxi driver, yet now everything was shifting. She couldn't grasp it. He wasn't just any driver, and she wasn't just some random passenger. The man's eyes were now warm, almost kind, and she could see the glimmer of something beneath his cool exterior. Something more than just a taxi driver. He wasn't what she had thought at all. "Come on," he said, offering her his hand. "I promise, it's not as crazy as it seems." And for a moment, Elena hesitated. She wanted to say no, to walk away, but she couldn't. She couldn't stop herself. So, she took his hand. It felt firm and reassuring as he led her onto the boat. The moment her foot touched the deck of the yacht, a shiver ran down her spine. The world around her felt like it had completely changed. There was no turning back now. She had no idea who this man was. She had no idea why he had brought her here. All she knew was that at this moment, she was about to step into a world she had never imagined, and everything she had ever known was about to change forever. For a fleeting second, she allowed herself to wonder how she had ended up in this situation. But then the man smiled at her again, and for some reason, that smile made everything feel less frightening. There was something disarming about him, something genuine. And suddenly, the city and the taxi seemed like a lifetime ago. She was no longer just a tired, overwhelmed woman trying to survive. She was standing on the edge of something new, something extraordinary. Elena had barely processed the events that had unfolded after stepping onto the yacht. The warm breeze of the ocean air filled her senses, and as she walked with the mysterious man toward the deck, she tried to push aside the thoughts that screamed in her head. How could she trust someone she knew so little about? Her mind raced, the reality of the situation slowly starting to catch up with her. How did I even get here? She thought, looking around at the yacht's gleaming lights, her heart still pounding with confusion. She glanced at the man beside her, trying to make sense of him. He was still dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans, just like the day she met him. Nothing about him screamed luxury, and yet here she was, aboard a private yacht that looked like something out of a high-end magazine. To Elena, the man still seemed like nothing more than an ordinary driver, a man who worked long hours for little recognition, whose life was just as hard as hers. He didn't fit the mold of the kind of rich man she had imagined would own something like this. She wondered if he wasn't just trying to impress her with the lavishness of the boat, a way to distract her from his real status. She couldn't help but think back to their first encounter, when he had picked her up from the curb in that old, tired taxi, the one that hadn't seemed to fit the bill of someone wealthy. It wasn't just the taxi. It was his whole demeanor that confused her. The way he spoke was so grounded, so down to earth. He had no air of arrogance or entitlement that most rich people wore like a badge. There was nothing in his posture that suggested he was the kind of man who might own a private yacht. At first, she assumed he was just a man like any other, a working-class guy doing his job. That assumption had been so deeply ingrained in her, based on her own life, that she couldn't help but project it onto him. She didn't understand why he had taken an interest in her, why someone like him would even care about someone like her. The glittering yacht, the private location. They all seemed too far out of her reach, too extravagant to fit the reality she had known for most of her life. To her, he was just a man who didn't know better, who thought a taxi ride could be an extravagant gesture. As they stood at the edge of the deck, overlooking the dark waters of the ocean, she began to doubt herself. What did she know about him? She tried to recall every detail, every interaction that might give her a clue to his true nature. The man had been polite, friendly even, but there was always a certain distance in his eyes, like he was hiding something important. Elena was still processing when he turned to face her, his expression unreadable, as if he could sense her unease. "You seem lost in thought," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper in the night air. She couldn't bring herself to look at him directly. Instead, she forced a smile and replied, "It's just a lot to take in." He nodded, not pressing her further. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than what she had seen. She couldn't help but think back to her struggles, her constant juggling of jobs, the long shifts, the endless hustle to survive. She had built walls around herself, convinced that people like her didn't belong in the circles of the wealthy. She had seen the way they acted, the arrogance they often carried, and she had assumed this man would be no different. Yet, here he was, breaking every assumption she had ever held. She still didn't understand why he had invited her here, why he had taken the time to even speak to her. Was it pity? Or was there something more? Elena was beginning to feel something stirring inside her, a strange mix of curiosity and hope. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the man she thought he was. Maybe he wasn't just another poor, struggling man trying to make a living. Maybe there was more to him than met the eye. As they stood there on the deck, the sounds of the waves crashing against the side of the yacht, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. Was it possible that she had misjudged him all along? Could he be someone entirely different from what she imagined? Her mind whirled with possibilities. But before she could voice any of these questions, the man spoke again, his voice soft but carrying a weight that made her pause. "Elena," he said, his eyes locking with hers, "you've been through a lot, haven't you?" She flinched, surprised by how accurately he seemed to read her. How did he know? He had only known her for a few hours, yet somehow he saw through her walls. She opened her mouth to respond, but found no words. Instead, she simply nodded, her gaze falling to the ground as a lump formed in her throat. She had been struggling for so long, trying to keep everything together, trying to convince herself that things would get better one day. But was that true? Or was she just fooling herself? The man studied her for a moment longer, as though seeing something deep inside her. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he said, "You don't have to pretend with me, Elena. I see you. I see what you're really about." Elena's heart skipped a beat. No one had ever said anything like that to her. In the world she knew, everyone was too busy to truly see her. She had spent years fighting for recognition, for respect. Yet, here was this stranger, this man who had started as nothing more than a cab driver in her eyes, speaking to her as if he understood everything she had been through. The words he spoke felt like a mirror, reflecting everything she had buried inside. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. She didn't feel like just another poor woman trying to get by. And for the first time, she didn't feel the need to hide the pain or the fear. Something was shifting in the air between them. And Elena had the strangest feeling that this night, this unexpected encounter, was going to change everything. Elena stood on the deck, the cold air wrapping around her as she tried to process everything. The waves crashed against the yacht's hull, and the city lights twinkled in the distance like a far-off dream. It was all so surreal. She had been driven to a yacht by a man she initially thought was just another ordinary taxi driver. And now she was stuck on a private yacht with him, surrounded by the ocean, and her mind was a storm of confusion. But there was one thing she couldn't deny: the connection between them. It was undeniable. The way he had looked at her earlier, the way his words had cut through the layers of defense she had built around herself, had left her with a strange mix of emotions. Was this real? Was it all some elaborate game? Or was there something deeper, something she couldn't quite grasp? She felt a pull toward him that she didn't understand, but at the same time, she felt a deep sense of caution. He was a stranger. No matter how much he seemed to understand her, she still knew so little about him. His kindness, the way he spoke to her with such understanding, had made her lower her guard, but the fear was still there, nagging at the back of her mind. Could she trust him? Could she trust her judgment? As she stood in the quiet of the night, she heard his voice again, breaking the silence. "Come with me," he said softly. Elena turned to look at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Where?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately, his eyes searching hers. There was a hesitation in his gaze, but it was quickly replaced with a kind of determination. "Trust me," he said, his voice calm but insistent. Elena hesitated. She didn't know why, but she found herself wanting to follow him. Maybe it was the way he had spoken to her earlier, or maybe it was the way he made her feel like she wasn't just another woman in a sea of people. But despite her reservations, she found herself nodding, her heart racing. "Okay," she whispered, and with that, she followed him. As they made their way down the narrow hallway of the yacht, Elena couldn't help but wonder what this was all about. She had no idea where they were going, but her curiosity had taken over. It was almost as though he was leading her into some kind of secret, something hidden from the world. Her thoughts swirled as she followed him, the air around them thick with tension. He didn't speak again, but the silence between them felt different now. It was charged, filled with an energy she couldn't quite describe. When they reached the door to a small room at the back of the yacht, the man turned to her, and finally spoke. "This is where I need you to trust me," he said, his voice low. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. "What's in there?" she asked, her heart pounding. He didn't answer immediately, only stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. "It's not what you think," he said, "but it's important that you see it for yourself." Elena stood frozen in place for a moment, unsure of what to do. This wasn't what she had expected. She had thought they were going to be spending the night enjoying the luxury of the yacht, relaxing, and maybe even having a nice dinner together. But this felt different. She glanced at the man, who stood there watching her intently, his expression unreadable. She could see the faintest glimmer of something in his eyes, something that made her wonder if she had any idea who he was. She took a deep breath, her heart racing as she stepped into the room. The moment she entered, she was hit with a wave of surprise. The room was not what she had expected. It wasn't lavish like the rest of the yacht. Instead, it was simple, almost austere, with a single desk in the center of the room and several boxes stacked neatly along the walls. But what caught her attention was the large photograph on the wall. It was of the man, but this time, he wasn't in his usual casual attire. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his hair neatly combed, his expression one of intense focus as he stood beside a group of people. They all looked important, dignified even. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as she took in the picture. The man stood behind her, his eyes focused on the photo as well. "This is me," he said softly. "But it's not who I am anymore." Elena turned to face him, confusion written on her face. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then walked toward the photo, his hand hovering over it but not quite touching it. "I used to be someone else," he said quietly. "Someone I didn't like. Someone I had to leave behind." His words hung in the air, and Elena felt a sudden chill. "What are you trying to tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That I'm not what I seem?" He didn't answer her directly. Instead, he walked over to the desk and began rummaging through the boxes. Elena watched him, her curiosity getting the better of her. She didn't know why, but there was something about this moment, this small room with its secrets, that made her feel as though she were on the edge of something big. He pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk, sliding it toward her. "This is my story," he said. "The one I've kept hidden for a long time." Elena stared at the folder, then back at him, her mind racing. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Why now?" He met her gaze, his eyes dark and filled with something she couldn't name. "Because I want you to understand," he said. "I want you to see who I really am." Elena's hands trembled as she opened the folder, revealing page after page of documents, photos, and letters. As she flipped through the pages, she found details of his life, things she had never imagined. The man standing before her, the one who had been so kind, so down to earth, had once been part of a world she couldn't even fathom. It was a world of wealth, power, and influence. The documents spoke of high-powered business deals, meetings with world leaders, and a life that had been carefully constructed to keep him in control of everything. Elena felt the weight of the papers in her hands as her mind tried to process the enormity of what she was seeing. He wasn't the broke taxi driver she had assumed. He was someone else entirely. "You see," he said, his voice low, "I walked away from all of this. I wanted to be free of it. But it's not so easy to escape." Elena slowly closed the folder, the realization sinking in. The man in front of her wasn't just any man. He was someone who had lived a life of privilege, of power, and had chosen to walk away from it all. She didn't know whether to be amazed or terrified. Her thoughts swirled, and the tension between them only grew stronger. This wasn't just an ordinary encounter anymore. It was something bigger, something that could change everything, and Elena had no idea where it would lead. Elena sat still in the room, the folder now closed in front of her. The weight of the documents, the pictures, and the letters that had been inside it seemed to press down on her, almost suffocating her with the intensity of the truth she was beginning to uncover. She couldn't believe it. She had thought she knew him. She had believed the man who had so gently guided her through the evening, the one who had treated her like she mattered in a world that rarely paid attention to people like her, was just an ordinary man, a humble taxi driver, trying to make a living, doing what he could to survive. But now everything she had believed was crumbling before her eyes. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. The words she wanted to say, the questions that raced through her mind, were trapped somewhere deep inside her chest. She didn't know where to begin. He was standing there, watching her, his expression unreadable. But she could see the sadness in his eyes, the flicker of something deeper than just the surface of this encounter. It wasn't the same man she had met earlier. The man who had seemed so genuine, so down to earth, was now someone she didn't recognize. He had been hiding a life, a truth so far removed from what he had presented to her. She felt betrayed. But why had he done it? Why had he deceived her? Why had he led her to believe that he was something that he wasn't? It was a question she had to ask. "Why?" she finally managed to say, her voice trembling as she looked up at him. He didn't answer right away, his gaze dropping to the floor as if the weight of his secrets was too much for him to carry. After a long moment, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "I wanted to see if you would like me for who I am," he said softly. The words hung in the air, making Elena's heart ache. "Is that why you kept the truth from me? Because you thought I wouldn't like you if I knew who you were?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. He shook his head. "No," he said, his voice low. "It's not that simple. I had to leave my old life behind. I couldn't bring you into it, not without knowing if you would still see me as me." His words made no sense to her, and yet they resonated with something deep inside her. She had seen a side of him that she hadn't expected, a side of him that was kind, genuine, and caring. But now, as the truth began to seep into her mind, she felt like she was standing in a different world, one that she couldn't quite comprehend. "I don't understand," she whispered, her hand shaking as she set the folder down on the desk. "Why would you hide something like this from me? Why not just tell me the truth?" He walked closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I needed to know if you would love me for who I am, not because of what I have or what I've done." He paused, his gaze softening. "I wanted you to see me, Elena. Not my past, not my wealth. Just me." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. She had believed in him. She had trusted him. But this truth, this revelation, shattered everything she thought she knew. She had been so caught up in the moment, in the way he made her feel, that she hadn't thought about the possibility that he was hiding something. Now the weight of that realization hit her like a tidal wave. She opened her eyes and looked at him, searching for some kind of answer, some clue as to what was real and what was just a lie. "So, what are you saying?" she asked softly. He reached out and gently touched her arm, his fingers warm against her skin. "I'm saying that I'm not who you thought I was," he said, his voice almost pleading. "But I am who you saw, the man you met, the one who cared for you, the one who made you laugh. That's who I am." Elena could feel the sincerity in his touch, in his words. She wanted to believe him, but the truth was hard to ignore. The man in front of her wasn't just an ordinary man. He wasn't a humble taxi driver with a quiet life. He was someone far more complicated, someone who had built a life of wealth, of power, of status. It wasn't just the money that was the issue. It was the deception, the lies, the secrets. "But why keep it from me?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why not just tell me the truth from the start?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing his hand over his face in frustration. "Because I didn't want to drag you into my world," he said, his voice tight. "You're not a part of that world, Elena. You don't belong in it, and I didn't want to ruin you by bringing you into it." She blinked in confusion. Ruin me? She repeated. You think your life is going to ruin me? He nodded slowly. Yes, he said, his voice heavy. Because when you live the kind of life I've lived, it changes you. It makes you into someone you're not. And I didn't want to become that man again. I didn't want to pull you into that. Elena took a step back, her mind racing. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond to this. The man she had seen, the one who had treated her with such kindness, the one who had made her feel like she mattered, was someone she didn't even recognize anymore. She didn't know what was real, what was the truth. The tension between them had shifted, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Was he telling her the truth? Was he just trying to protect her? Or was this all just part of some grand scheme, some plan that she was too naive to see? She didn't know. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in the man who had been kind to her, who had shared his life with her, and who had treated her like she was the most important person in the world, the man who had been so different from the world he came from. But how could she trust him when she didn't even know the whole truth? She took a deep breath, steadying herself. So, who are you really? She asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly. He met her gaze, his expression filled with something she couldn't quite name. I'm a man who's trying to escape his past, he said simply. But I'm also a man who's trying to find something real. Elena swallowed hard, her heart heavy with emotion. And do you think that something real is me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly. I do, he said. I think it's you. And in that moment, Elena realized that maybe, just maybe, she could believe in him. The truth was complicated, messy, and painful. But the man standing before her was the same man who had made her feel seen, made her feel important. And despite everything, she couldn't deny the connection between them. But there were still so many questions, so many things she didn't understand, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to dive into the world he was offering her. But one thing was for sure. This was only the beginning of a journey she hadn't expected to take. Elena stepped out of the sleek, luxury yacht, her breath caught in her throat as she gazed at the expansive, pristine, private island before her. The white, sandy beaches stretched out in front of her like a scene from a postcard, the waves lapping gently against the shore. It was a place she could never have imagined, a place so removed from her reality that it felt almost surreal. She had only been in his world for a short time, but now, standing on the island, she realized that there was so much more to it than she could have ever fathomed. The man she had thought was a simple taxi driver had just revealed to her an entire hidden world of unimaginable wealth and luxury. She could hardly wrap her head around the idea that this was his world, his life. Everything felt so foreign to her, and yet, there was something undeniably captivating about it. The palm trees swayed in the gentle breeze, and the turquoise water sparkled under the sun. This was not the world she knew. This was a different reality, a world of private jets, billion-dollar yachts, and secluded islands. She turned to him, trying to make sense of the scene before her. He was standing by her side, his presence calm and reassuring, as if this was just another day in his life. He had changed into a simple yet refined outfit, his usual confident demeanor still intact. There was something about him now, something different than before. The mask he had worn, the one of a humble taxi driver, was gone, replaced by the man who had hidden his true self from her. A man with power, influence, and wealth beyond her comprehension. This is your world, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. This is where you belong. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Yes, he said simply. But this is not where I want to be, at least not alone. I brought you here because I want you to see what I've been hiding. I want you to understand why I've kept this part of me secret. Elena stood still, processing his words, her mind racing. She had heard him speak about his past, about the things he had left behind, but seeing it in front of her was entirely different. She had no idea that the world he had been hiding from her was so vast, so beautiful, so overwhelming. She took a few steps forward, looking out at the horizon, where the sky met the water in an endless expanse of blue. It felt like a dream. A part of her wanted to deny it all, to retreat into her safe, familiar world. But another part of her, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, was captivated by this new world. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. "Why hide it from me?" she asked, turning back to face him. "Why not tell me about this from the beginning? Why keep this secret?" He sighed, walking over to her, his footsteps light on the soft sand. "Because I didn't want you to think I was trying to impress you," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I didn't want you to love me for the wrong reasons." Elena's heart skipped a beat. "And now? What do you expect from me now that you've shown me all this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He smiled softly, his gaze gentle. "I expect nothing," he said. "I just want you to understand that this is my reality. But it's not everything. It's not the most important thing." Elena was silent for a long moment, taking in the stunning view, the wealth surrounding her, and the perfect, almost cinematic beauty of the island. She had come from a life where wealth was something that only existed in magazines or on television, something that seemed so far out of reach that it felt like a fairy tale. But now, standing on this island, with him by her side, everything felt so close, so real. She wanted to ask him more questions, so many questions, but the words seemed to escape her. She didn't know where to begin. The island was beautiful, but it was also a symbol of everything that had been hidden from her, everything she had been kept in the dark about. She turned to him, her expression serious. "Why this place?" she asked, gesturing to the island. "Why not take me somewhere else? Why here?" He looked at her thoughtfully, as if weighing his words carefully. "Because this place represents everything I've worked for," he said. "But it also represents everything I've left behind. I wanted you to see this, because I want you to understand what I've been running from. This island is a part of who I am, but it's not the part that matters most to me anymore." Elena was taken aback by his honesty. She had expected him to explain this world to her in terms of power and prestige. But instead, he was speaking to her about what he had given up, about what he had sacrificed to be here. It was a side of him she hadn't seen before, a vulnerable, conflicted side that only deepened her intrigue. She felt a connection to him now, one that was stronger than ever. This wasn't about the island. It wasn't about the wealth or the status. It was about something deeper. She wasn't sure if she fully understood it yet, but there was something in his eyes, something in the way he spoke to her, that made her feel like she was being invited into a secret world, the real world, his world. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice soft. "What happens now that you've shown me all of this?" He stepped closer to her, his gaze never leaving hers. "Now, I'm asking you to stay," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Stay and see if we can build something real. Not based on wealth, not based on power, but on what we can give each other. I want you to see me for who I am, Elena. Not the man who owns this island, not the man with the wealth and the privilege, but the man who's standing right here with you." Elena looked into his eyes, and for the first time since arriving on the island, she felt a sense of clarity. She wasn't just looking at a wealthy man, a man with power and influence. She was looking at someone who had been torn between two worlds, someone who was searching for something real amid all the luxuries that surrounded him. The island, the wealth, the status, they all felt like distractions, like the things that had kept him from truly living. And maybe, just maybe, he was looking for her to help him find that. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "I'll stay." A smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he reached out and gently took her hand in his. "Thank you," he said softly. And for the first time since arriving on the island, Elena felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Ready to explore not just the island, but also the hidden depths of the man who had brought her here. What she had thought was an impossible world was now becoming a place where she might just find herself. The gentle sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the air as Elena walked slowly beside him along the pristine beach. The golden sunlight was beginning to fade into the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow across the island. The soft sand beneath their feet felt like a cushion, each step they took sinking in harmony with the rhythm of the ocean. As they walked, Elena's thoughts were a whirlwind. She had never expected any of this to happen, not in her wildest dreams. What had started as an encounter with a humble taxi driver had transformed into something far greater, far more complicated. She had always thought she understood love, but everything about this situation was different. It felt like a strange, uncharted territory she was being led into. And yet, despite the confusion and the overwhelming nature of it all, there was a connection that was slowly growing between them. She could feel it now. Something that was just beginning to form, but was undeniable all the same. Nicholas, the man she had thought was simply a driver, was now someone who had shown her an entirely different world. A world of opulence, of privacy, of luxuries she had never known existed. But it wasn't the private island or the lavish lifestyle that kept drawing her to him. It was something deeper, something intangible that she couldn't quite explain. The way he spoke to her, the way he looked at her, it was different. There was a kindness in his eyes, a gentleness that she hadn't expected to find in a man who had so much. They had spent the past few hours exploring the island, talking, laughing, and gradually shedding the layers of the initial awkwardness that had defined their first meeting. And now, walking along the beach at sunset, it felt as though time had slowed down, as if the world around them was fading away, leaving only the two of them. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken words that neither of them was yet ready to express. But Elena could sense that something was changing. She could feel the shift in the air, a spark that had begun to flicker and was now slowly growing into something more. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye, her heart skipping a beat. There was something about him, something magnetic. His tall, commanding presence was softened by his smile, and there was a warmth in his gaze that she couldn't ignore. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time in a way that went beyond the surface level, beyond her appearance, or the life she came from. "Elena," he said softly, breaking the silence, his voice low and sincere. She turned to him, meeting his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. His gaze held her captive, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to disappear. There was no island, no wealth, no facade, just the two of them standing on the beach, surrounded by the sounds of the ocean. "I know this is all a lot to take in," he continued, his voice gentle. "I never meant to overwhelm you, and I didn't want you to feel like you had to be a part of this world. I brought you here to show you who I am, but more than that, I want you to see who I could be with you. I want you to see me as more than just the man with the island." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had always known there was more to him than the persona he had put on. The man standing before her was vulnerable, open, and honest, qualities she hadn't expected from someone so powerful. She smiled softly, a small yet genuine gesture that conveyed the emotions she wasn't ready to express yet. "I see you," she said quietly, her voice full of meaning. "I see you for who you are, not for what you have. And that's why I'm here." There was a brief silence between them, one that felt charged with electricity. It wasn't just the beauty of the island or the wealth surrounding them. It was something deeper. It was the unspoken connection that had been growing between them since the moment they met. Nicholas stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out slowly, almost hesitantly, as if unsure of her response. Elena's heart raced, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she took a small step toward him, her breath catching in her throat. The distance between them felt infinitesimal now. His fingers brushed lightly against hers, and a spark seemed to ignite between them. It was a simple touch, a gentle connection, but in that moment, everything shifted. The air felt different, charged with an energy neither of them had expected. For the first time, Elena realized that she was no longer seeing him as just a man with an island. She was seeing him as someone who had the potential to be much more. The touch was enough to send a flood of emotions rushing through her. She had always been guarded, always kept her emotions in check. But now, in this moment, surrounded by the beauty of the island and the growing bond between them, she felt vulnerable. And yet, she didn't want to hide it. She didn't want to run from the connection that was forming between them. "Nicholas," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. He stopped in his tracks and turned to her, his face a mix of curiosity and understanding. "What is it?" he asked softly, his voice almost a whisper. Elena took a deep breath, gathering the courage she hadn't known she had. "I don't know what this is, or where it's going," she began, her words tentative but sincere. "But I can't deny what I'm feeling. I can't deny that there's something between us." Nicholas's gaze softened, and he took another step closer to her, closing the distance between them. His hand gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin in a gesture so tender that it made her heart flutter. "I feel it too," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I didn't expect any of this, but I'm not going to run from it. I don't want to run from it." Elena's pulse quickened as he leaned in, his lips brushing against her forehead in a soft, lingering kiss. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but it held a promise, a sense of intimacy that spoke volumes. The moment was everything, simple, yet profound. It was the first step in a journey they hadn't planned, but were both eager to explore. As they stood there, enveloped in the quiet beauty of the island, Elena knew that something had changed between them. It wasn't just the island, the wealth, or the lifestyle that had brought them here. It was the connection they shared. And that connection, fragile and tender as it was, had the potential to become something more. Something real. She leaned into his touch, her hand resting gently on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The world around them seemed to disappear as they stood there together, two people from very different worlds, but drawn to each other in a way that neither could explain. It was the beginning of something new, something that could change everything. The evening sun had long dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, dim light over the private island. The air was cool now, with only the faintest breeze stirring the trees as Nicholas and Elena sat side by side on a quiet terrace overlooking the ocean. They had spent the day exploring the island, and despite the natural beauty that surrounded them, Elena felt a strange tension between them. It was as if the unspoken words lingered in the air, each one heavier than the last, and both of them knew that something needed to be said. They had shared intimate moments, touches that had sparked a connection neither could ignore. But still, something was left unsaid. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Nicholas than what he had shown her. She had seen glimpses of his vulnerability, moments when his guard had slipped just enough for her to notice, but she still didn't fully understand him. What made him the man he was today? Why did he live this life, surrounded by so much wealth, yet seemed so detached from it at times? And more importantly, why had he brought her here? The questions swirled in her mind as she sat beside him, watching the waves crash softly against the shore. Nicholas, sensing the unspoken tension between them, turned to her. His gaze was steady, calm, but there was a hint of something deeper in his eyes. "Elena," he began, his voice low but sincere, "I know I haven't been entirely honest with you." His words caught her attention immediately. She turned to him, her heart skipping a beat as she met his eyes. There was something in his tone, something that told her this conversation was going to be different from any they had had before. "I've been keeping a part of myself hidden from you," he continued, his voice almost apologetic. "Not because I don't trust you, but because..." I wasn't sure if I could trust myself. Elena raised an eyebrow. Curiosity piqued. She shifted slightly in her seat, her attention fully on him. What do you mean? She asked gently. Nicholas took a deep breath, his eyes drifting away from hers for a moment as if searching for the right words. I come from a world of privilege, Elena, he said, his voice tinged with a quiet sadness. A world where people only see what I have. Money, power, influence, and nothing more. But that's not who I am. It's never been who I wanted to be. Elena listened intently, sensing that he was about to reveal something important. I've been carrying the weight of my family's legacy for as long as I can remember, he continued, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. My father built this empire, and I've been expected to follow in his footsteps, to carry the family name, uphold the reputation, and live a life of luxury. But all of that comes with expectations. Expectations that are suffocating. Elena's heart went out to him as she watched him struggle with his words. She had always known there was more to him than the facade he presented, but hearing him speak so openly about his struggles was unexpected. I didn't ask for this life, Elena, Nicholas continued, his voice raw with honesty. I didn't ask to be the heir to everything my father built. I didn't ask to be judged by what I have, rather than who I am. But it's hard to escape it, especially when everyone expects you to be something you're not. Elena felt a pang of empathy in her chest. She had always admired Nicholas's strength, but now she saw a different side of him. A side that was vulnerable, conflicted, and lost. I don't know what to do with all of this, he admitted, his voice faltering slightly. I don't know how to be the person they want me to be. I don't know how to live up to their expectations and still be true to myself. And when I met you, Elena, it felt like for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to pretend. You saw me. Not the billionaire, not the heir, just me. And that meant everything to me. Elena felt a rush of emotions. She hadn't expected this level of honesty from him, but now that it was out in the open, she realized how much it changed everything. She had always seen him as more than the wealth and the power he wielded, but hearing him admit his struggles made her realize how much pressure he had been under all these years. I don't want to live this life anymore, Nicholas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to be trapped by expectations and the weight of other people's opinions. But at the same time, I don't know how to break free from it. I'm afraid of what will happen if I do. Elena's heart ached for him. She reached out, placing her hand on his, offering him comfort in the way she knew best. You don't have to do this alone, she said softly. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You've already shown me who you really are. Someone kind, someone generous, someone who is willing to give of himself, even when it's hard. That's who you are, Nicholas. Not the man with the island, not the man with the money, but the man who cares, who listens, who loves. Nicholas looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something more profound. I don't deserve you, he said quietly, his voice breaking slightly. Elena shook her head, her heart swelling with emotion. You don't have to deserve anything, Nicholas. You just have to be you. That's enough. For a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. There was no private island, no wealth, no expectations. Just the two of them, sitting together in the quiet of the night, sharing their truths. In that moment, Elena realized that she had always known the man Nicholas was beneath the surface. And now, for the first time, he was starting to see it too. Thank you, he whispered, his voice full of sincerity. Thank you for seeing me. Elena smiled softly, her heart full. I always have, Nicholas. And I always will. As they sat there in the quiet stillness, Elena knew that this conversation had changed everything. Nicholas had revealed his true self to her, and in doing so, he had allowed her to see the depth of his vulnerability, his strength, and his heart. And in that moment, she knew they were on the same page, ready to face whatever came next together. As days passed on the private island, Elena found herself torn between two worlds. The connection she had with Nicholas was undeniable. There was an attraction that grew stronger with every passing moment. He was kind, thoughtful, and unlike anyone she had ever met before. Yet, as much as she felt drawn to him, a part of her couldn't help but feel uncertain about everything that surrounded him. Nicholas was a man of immense wealth, someone who had been raised in a world of luxury, power, and expectations. And here she was, a woman who had lived a simple life, worked as a cleaning lady, and never imagined she'd find herself in the presence of such opulence. Every time she looked at him, she was reminded of the disparity between their worlds. The private island, the sprawling mansion, the perfectly tailored suits, all of it made her feel out of place. But despite her reservations, something within her told her that Nicholas was different. He had shown her sides of himself that most people would never see. He had revealed his vulnerabilities, his fears, his desire for something more than just wealth and status. And in those moments, when he let his guard down, Elena couldn't help but fall deeper into the attraction that was growing between them. Nicholas had a way of making her feel seen, like she wasn't just another woman on his arm, but someone he genuinely cared about. He would listen to her, truly listen, as if her thoughts and opinions mattered. It was a rare feeling, one that Elena had never experienced in her past relationships. But there was a catch. The more time they spent together, the more Elena found herself torn between her growing feelings for him and the reality of their situation. Nicholas's life was one of extravagance, and although he seemed to despise the pressures that came with it, she couldn't ignore the fact that they were an intrinsic part of who he was. His wealth, his power, his family's legacy. Those were things that shaped his every decision, and Elena knew she wasn't part of that world. She couldn't even begin to imagine what it would be like to fit into his life fully. She couldn't just let go of the realities of her own existence. Every time they shared a laugh, every time their eyes met in that intimate way, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they eventually had to face the world beyond the island. Would it all fall apart? Could they survive in the outside world when their worlds were so vastly different? One moment, Elena would find herself captivated by Nicholas's charm and the warmth he brought to her life. She'd let herself imagine a future with him, one where they could live freely, without the constraints of wealth and societal expectations. But then, in the next breath, doubt would creep in. Was she just another fleeting distraction for him? Would he ever truly choose her over his family's demands? Could he possibly love someone like her? The emotional tug-of-war was exhausting, but Elena couldn't bring herself to let go of him. Every time they shared a quiet moment together, every time he looked at her with such tenderness, she felt like she was seeing the real Nicholas, the man behind the facade of wealth and power. She didn't care about his money or status. What she cared about was the way he made her feel, like she was enough, just as she was. But still, the doubts remained. Could she really leave her life behind and join him in a world that felt so foreign? Could she be the woman he needed, or was she just someone who would never quite fit into his life? Nicholas seemed to sense her inner conflict, and as much as he tried to reassure her, Elena couldn't help but question whether it was enough. Was it enough for him to want her despite the differences between them? Was it enough for him to truly choose her over the life he had always known? The growing attraction between them was undeniable, but it was laced with uncertainty. Elena knew that love was never simple, especially when the stakes were this high. She had seen how Nicholas was constantly torn between his duty to his family and the life he wanted for himself. And she wondered, if it came down to it, would he choose her? Would he give up everything he had been taught to value for the chance to build a life with her? She watched him closely, noticing the way his eyes softened when they shared a private moment, how he reached for her hand when they were alone. But at the same time, she noticed the moments when his eyes would darken with worry, when he would look out toward the horizon, as if he was searching for something he couldn't quite grasp. The contradictions were maddening. There were moments when Elena felt like she had all the answers. She knew she cared for Nicholas, and she believed that they could make something beautiful together. But then, there were other moments. Moments when she saw the weight of his responsibilities, the expectations that hung over him like a cloud, that made her question everything. She wasn't sure if she was strong enough to handle the challenges that came with being with someone like him. The island was a world apart from the realities of the outside world, and Elena knew that soon enough, they would have to face those realities. She couldn't live in a bubble forever. The thought of returning to her life, of facing the judgment of those who might view her relationship with Nicholas as something unattainable or even absurd, weighed heavily on her. Could she handle the pressure? Could she stand beside him when the world would surely judge their love? Nicholas, too, seemed aware of the challenges that lay ahead. He had given her everything in this idyllic setting, his time, his affection, his trust, but he knew that eventually, the walls of this private world would come crashing down. He had his own doubts about their future, but the way he looked at Elena made it clear that he wasn't ready to let go of her. "I wish you could see what I see in you," he had confessed one evening, his voice raw with emotion. "I see the strength, the beauty, the kindness that no one else sees. I see the woman who doesn't need anything from me, except for me to be myself. And that's all I want to be for you. Myself." Elena had tried to suppress the tears that threatened to spill over at his words, knowing that deep down, she wasn't sure if she was ready to be the woman he needed. She wanted to be that woman. She wanted to be the one who stood beside him, proud and unashamed. But she couldn't ignore the doubts that clung to her, the fears of what their love might cost them both. The attraction between them was undeniable. But the deeper they went into this relationship, the more Elena realized how complicated it truly was. She didn't just have to love Nicholas. She had to be willing to face the challenges of their different worlds, to confront the insecurities that came with being part of a life so foreign to her. And as much as she wanted to dive headfirst into the love that was blossoming between them, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something she might not be ready for. The more Nicholas opened up to her, the more she felt drawn to him. But she also felt the weight of her fears and doubts pressing in. Would their love be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds? Or would it break under the pressure of expectations, realities, and insecurities? The growing attraction was undeniable. But the questions lingered. And for Elena, those questions might just be the thing that kept her from fully giving herself to Nicholas. She was torn between the undeniable pull of her feelings for him and the harsh realities of what it meant to be with someone like him. Elena sat by the shoreline, the waves gently lapping at the sand as she hugged her knees to her chest. The past few days on the island had been unlike anything she had ever experienced. It felt like a dream, one she never wanted to wake up from. And yet, deep in her heart, there was a storm brewing. No matter how much she wanted to believe in the fantasy of Nicholas's love, she couldn't ignore the fears clawing at her from the inside. She had spent her entire life struggling, always conscious of her place in the world, always aware of the unspoken rules that divided the rich from the poor. Nicholas had given her glimpses of a different life, one filled with warmth, laughter, and a connection that felt so real. But could she truly belong in his world? Would she ever feel like she was enough for him? The questions haunted her, invading her thoughts even in the quietest moments. And tonight, as she stared out at the endless ocean, she knew she couldn't run from them anymore. She had to face the truth. She had to confront her fears. Nicholas found her there, just as he always seemed to know when something was on her mind. Without a word, he sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken emotions. "You're thinking again," he finally said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Elena let out a shaky breath. "I can't help it." He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers before lacing them together. "Talk to me." She hesitated, unsure of how to put her thoughts into words. But she had promised herself she wouldn't hide from this conversation any longer. "Nicholas," she began softly, "I need to know, what happens when we leave this island?" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "I mean this," she gestured around them. "Everything here feels perfect. like we exist in our own little world where nothing else matters. But it's not real, is it? At some point, we have to go back. You have a life waiting for you. Responsibilities, expectations, and I don't fit into that world. Nicholas's grip on her hand tightened. Elena, you're wrong. What we have, is real. It's the most real thing I've ever known. But will it still feel that way when we're surrounded by people who think I don't belong with you? When your family, your friends, the world, when they all judge me for not being like them? Nicholas's jaw clenched. I don't care what they think. Maybe you don't, she whispered. But I do. She pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself. I've spent my whole life feeling like I wasn't enough, and being here with you, in this beautiful place, has made me feel like I'm living someone else's life. Like any second now, I'll wake up and realize this was just a fantasy. Nicholas turned her face toward him, his thumb gently brushing against her cheek. Elena, listen to me. This isn't a fantasy. What I feel for you is real. And I don't want a life without you in it. Her eyes searched his, desperate to believe him, but the fear still lingered. How can you be so sure? He exhaled slowly, his voice quieter this time. Because when I met you, I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't expecting you. But you walked into my life and turned everything upside down. You make me feel alive in a way I never have before. You see me, not the wealth, not the power, just me. And that means more than anything in the world. Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She wanted so badly to believe in his words, to let go of the fear that held her back. But years of self-doubt weren't so easily erased. Nicholas, I'm scared, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared that if I let myself fall for you completely, I'll get hurt. That one day, you'll wake up and realize I was just a phase. That you'll see me the way everyone else will, as someone who doesn't belong in your world. Nicholas's expression softened, and he cupped her face in his hands. You belong with me, Elena. Not because of where you come from or what you have, but because of who you are. And if you're scared, then let me be the one to prove to you that this is real. Let me fight for you. Her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever fought for her before. No one had ever looked at her the way Nicholas did now, with unwavering certainty, with a love so deep it scared her. And maybe that was the real reason she had been so afraid. Because loving him meant risking everything. Loving him meant letting go of the walls she had built around herself, of the insecurities that had shaped her for so long. But what if it's not enough, she whispered. What if love isn't enough to bridge the gap between our worlds? Nicholas shook his head. Love isn't just enough, Elena. It's everything. And I will spend every day proving to you that what we have is worth fighting for. The conviction in his voice sent shivers down her spine. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to take the leap, to trust that love could conquer the doubts and fears that held her back. But trust wasn't easy. Not when she had spent a lifetime protecting herself from disappointment. And yet, as Nicholas pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to stop letting fear dictate her future. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just scared of getting hurt. She was scared of losing something, someone, that had come to mean more to her than she ever thought possible. And that, more than anything, was worth facing the truth. Elena woke up to the sound of waves crashing gently against the shore, the salty breeze filling the air. The past few days on Nicholas's private island had been like a dream. Beautiful, intense, and completely surreal. And yet, beneath all the magic, there was an undeniable truth she couldn't escape. Their worlds were so different. No matter how deeply she felt for Nicholas, the reality was that they came from opposite sides of life. She had spent years struggling, working endless shifts just to make ends meet. He, on the other hand, had never known what it was like to go without. She rolled over to find Nicholas sitting on the balcony, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Even in the quiet moments, there was something commanding about him, as if he carried the weight of an entire empire on his shoulders. She hesitated before stepping outside, unsure of how to voice the concerns swirling in her mind. But Nicholas must have sensed her presence because he turned to her with a small smile. "You're up early," he said, reaching for her hand and pulling her down beside him. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Too much on my mind." He studied her carefully, his fingers tracing absent patterns on the back of her hand. "Talk to me." She took a deep breath. "Nicholas, do you ever think about what happens after this?" His smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, us," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "We're living in this perfect bubble here. But eventually, we'll have to go back to the real world. And when that happens, will this still work? Can we really make this work?" Nicholas exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "I won't lie to you, Elena. Our worlds are different. I know that. But that doesn't mean we can't find a way to be together." "But how?" she asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "Nicholas, I don't belong in your world. I don't know how to fit into that life." He frowned. "You don't have to fit into anything, Elena. You just have to be yourself." "It's not that simple," she murmured. "People like me, we don't get fairy tale endings with men like you. Your family, your business partners, your world, they'll never accept someone like me." Nicholas's jaw tightened. "I don't care what they think." She shook her head. "You say that now, but what happens when the pressure starts? When your family starts questioning if I'm good enough for you? When the media digs into my past and starts twisting everything?" Nicholas reached out, cupping her face in his hands. "Elena, listen to me. I didn't fall for some perfect version of you. I fell for the woman who challenged me, who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, who saw me as more than just a name or a bank account. That's the woman I want in my life." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to silence the doubts screaming inside her head. But it wasn't just about love. It was about survival. And she wasn't sure if love alone was enough to bridge the gap between their lives. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet moments and lingering glances. They fell into an easy rhythm. Long walks on the beach, late-night conversations under the stars, playful teasing that made her forget, just for a moment, that there was a world outside this island waiting for them. But no matter how much she tried to push her fears aside, they were always there, lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't until one evening, when Nicholas insisted on cooking dinner, that things finally came to a head. "You're really going to cook?" she teased, watching as he fumbled with the stove. "You sound surprised," he said, flashing her a grin. "You don't exactly strike me as the type who spends much time in the kitchen," she admitted. Nicholas smirked. "I'll have you know I make a mean pasta." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" "Really." He turned back to the stove, only to curse under his breath when he realized he had turned on the wrong burner. Elena burst out laughing, unable to hold it in. Nicholas shot her a playful glare. "You think this is funny?" "A little," she admitted between giggles. "The great Nicholas Sterling, billionaire CEO, can handle boardrooms but not a stovetop. I'd like to see you do better," he challenged, crossing his arms. She stepped forward, gently pushing him aside. "Move over, rich boy. Let me show you how it's done." As she started chopping vegetables, Nicholas leaned against the counter, watching her with an amused expression. "You're enjoying this way too much." "Maybe a little," she teased. "I guess I just like seeing you out of your element for once." He studied her for a long moment before saying, "You know, I like seeing you like this too." "Like what?" "Comfortable. Happy." She hesitated, the light-hearted mood suddenly shifting. "I do feel happy here," she admitted. "But I don't know if it's real." Nicholas frowned. "What do you mean?" She sighed. "I mean, us. It works here, on this island, away from everything. But what happens when we go back?" What if I can't handle the pressure? What if I don't fit into your life the way you think I will? Nicholas stepped closer, his expression serious. Then we figure it out. Together. But what if— No more what ifs, Elena, he interrupted. We'll never have all the answers. But I know one thing for certain. I don't want to lose you. She swallowed hard, emotion rising in her throat. Nicholas, you're scared. I get that. But so am I, he admitted. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who only see me as my last name. But you see me for who I really am. And that's worth fighting for. Elena felt something shift inside her. Maybe love couldn't erase all their differences, but it could give them a reason to try. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As Nicholas pulled her into his arms, she realized that no matter how complicated things got, no matter how different their worlds were, she didn't want to walk away. She wanted to see where this path led, even if it terrified her. Because sometimes, the greatest risks led to the most beautiful rewards. Just when Elena thought she and Nicholas were finally in sync, the past came crashing back like an unforgiving tide. It started subtly, small moments where she caught Nicholas staring at her with a look she couldn't quite place. Not admiration, not love, but something deeper, something darker. Doubt. At first she brushed it off, convincing herself that she was imagining it. But the shift in his energy was impossible to ignore. His playful teasing became more measured, his easy laughter less frequent. He would go silent at times, lost in thought. And when she asked what was wrong, he'd force a smile and tell her it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. And she had a sinking feeling she knew what it was. She wasn't the only one with doubts. Nicholas had them too. And the realization terrified her. The confrontation came on a warm afternoon, just as they were finishing lunch on the terrace. The ocean breeze was perfect. The sun cast a golden glow over the island, but the tension between them was undeniable. Elena had barely touched her food, her mind too preoccupied with the unspoken words hanging between them. Nicholas, on the other hand, had been unusually quiet, his piercing gaze fixed on her like he was searching for something. Answers, maybe. Nicholas, she finally said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. What's wrong? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the table. Who is he? The question hit her like a slap. Her heart stuttered. What? Nicholas's expression was unreadable, but there was an edge to his voice. The man you were with before me. Elena's stomach tightened. Why are you asking about this? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Because I need to know, Elena. I can't stop thinking about it. There's a part of your life I don't know, and it's driving me insane. My past relationships have nothing to do with us, she said carefully. But Nicholas shook his head. Don't do that. Don't brush it off like it doesn't matter. It doesn't, she insisted. But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. Did it? He let out a humorless laugh. So there was someone. She clenched her fists under the table. Of course there was. I didn't live in a bubble before I met you, Nicholas. His jaw tightened. Who was he? Why does it matter? She countered. Because I need to understand, he admitted. I need to know what kind of man you loved before me. What kind of love you had before me. She hesitated. This was dangerous territory. The past had a way of creeping into the present, poisoning what was supposed to be new, fresh, untouched. But Nicholas wasn't going to let this go. His name was Daniel, she finally said. Nicholas's expression darkened. And? She sighed. And it was a mistake. We were together for 2 years. I thought it was love, but I was wrong. Why? He pressed. She hesitated. Because he wasn't who I thought he was. Meaning? Meaning he lied to me, she said, her voice bitter. He made me believe I was the only one, that we had something real. But the whole time, he was seeing someone else. Nicholas's hands curled into fists. He cheated on you? She nodded. Repeatedly. And I was stupid enough to believe his excuses. I wanted so badly to believe he loved me that I ignored the signs. Nicholas's expression hardened. Did he hurt you? She swallowed. Not physically. But he made me feel like I was never enough. Like no matter what I did, I'd always be second to someone else. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Nicholas was staring at her like he wanted to destroy something. I hate him, he muttered under his breath. She let out a dry laugh. Join the club. But Nicholas wasn't laughing. He looked genuinely angry, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. I don't understand how any man could treat you that way. Because he didn't love me, she said simply. Not the way I deserved to be loved. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, Is that why you're so hesitant with me? Why do you keep pushing me away? Her breath caught. I'm not pushing you away. Aren't you? He challenged. Every time we get close, you hesitate. Every time I tell you I want a future with you, you shut down. Is it because of him? Nicholas, tell me the truth, Elena. She looked away, her heart pounding. I don't know. You do know, he insisted. You're afraid. You're afraid I'll hurt you the way he did. She squeezed her eyes shut. I just don't want to be that girl again, she whispered. The one who gives her heart away so easily, only to have it shattered. Elena, Nicholas said softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. I'm not him. Her throat tightened. I know that. Then let me prove it to you, he said. Let me show you what it means to be loved the right way. Tears burned the back of her eyes. And what if I can't? Then I'll wait, he said simply, for as long as it takes. She looked at him then, really looked at him. This man, this stubborn, frustrating, incredible man, was offering her something she never thought she'd have. A patient love. A love that didn't demand or pressure. A love that was real. Maybe she wasn't ready. Maybe she'd never be. But as Nicholas squeezed her hand, as he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, she realized something. She wanted to try. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just afraid of falling. She was afraid of what she'd lose if she didn't. The waves crashed against the shore. A rhythmic melody that filled the air as Elena stood on the edge of the private island's dock, staring out at the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of gold and pink, the setting sun casting a soft glow over the water. It should have been peaceful, but inside, she was a storm. Her conversation with Nicholas earlier that day had shaken her to her core. The way he had looked at her, the way he had held her hand, the promise in his voice. It was too much. Too real. Too terrifying. And yet, despite the fear clawing at her chest, she couldn't deny what she felt. She had tried to fight it, tried to convince herself that this was just a fleeting connection, a fantasy that would fade the moment they returned to the real world. But every time Nicholas looked at her, every time he spoke her name, she knew the truth. She was falling for him. And that terrified her more than anything. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear him approach. You're thinking too much again. His voice was soft, teasing, but there was an underlying seriousness to it. She turned to find Nicholas standing behind her, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He was dressed casually, his shirt unbuttoned at the top, his sleeves rolled up, the ocean breeze ruffling his dark hair. He looked effortlessly perfect, and it made her heart ache. It's a bad habit, she admitted. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing right beside her. What are you thinking about? She hesitated. Us. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. That's a good thing, right? She sighed, turning her gaze back to the water. I don't know. Nicholas was silent for a moment before he spoke again. Do you trust me? The question caught her off guard. She looked up at him, her heart hammering. What? Do you trust me, Elena? He repeated, his eyes searching hers. She swallowed hard. I want to. His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. Come with me. Before she could protest, he took her hand and led her away from the dock. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of sand beneath their feet and the distant crash of waves. Elena had no idea where they were going, but she followed without question, her pulse quickening with every step. After a few minutes, they reached a secluded part of the island, a clearing surrounded by towering palm trees. In the center, a small table was set up with flickering candles, a bottle of champagne, and 2 glasses. Fairy lights were strung between the trees, casting a warm glow over the scene. It looked like something out of a dream. Nicholas, she breathed, her chest tightening. He turned to face her, his expression serious. Sit with me. She hesitated for only a moment before obeying, lowering herself onto the chair opposite him. He poured them each a glass of champagne, but she barely noticed. Her heart was racing, her hands trembling. Something was happening, something big. I brought you here because there's something I need to say, Nicholas began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Something I've been holding back for too long. She swallowed. Okay. He exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. When I met you, I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't looking for love, for something real. But then, you walked into my life, and everything changed. Her breath caught. Nicholas, let me finish, he said gently. You've seen the world I come from. The money, the power, the expectations. Everyone assumes they know me, that they understand what I want. But you never treated me like a billionaire. You never cared about the wealth, the status. You saw me, Elena, the real me. Tears stung the back of her eyes. And that terrified me, he admitted. Because if you saw the real me, it meant you had the power to break me. And I swore I'd never let anyone do that again. Elena's chest tightened. Nicholas. But then I realized something, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I realized that I don't care. I'd rather take the risk of getting hurt than live a life without you in it. Her breath hitched. What are you saying? He reached into his pocket, and before she could process what was happening, he dropped to one knee. Time stopped. Her vision blurred. Nicholas! Elena, he said, his voice unwavering. I love you. I love the way you challenge me, the way you see through my walls, the way you make me feel like I can finally be myself. I don't want this to be temporary. I don't want to let you go. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Are you proposing? His lips curved into a small smile. I know this is fast. I know we haven't had the most traditional love story. But nothing about us has ever been conventional, and I don't want to waste any more time pretending I don't know what I want. He opened the small velvet box in his hand, revealing a stunning yet simple diamond ring. Marry me. Elena's breath came in short, shaky gasps. Nicholas, He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. I don't expect an answer right now. I don't want you to say yes because you feel pressured. I just want you to know that this is real for me, that I'm all in. More tears slipped down her cheeks. You're serious. Dead serious. She let out a shaky laugh. You barely know me. I know enough, he said simply. I know that you're the first person who's ever made me feel like more than just my money. I know that you make me laugh when I don't want to. I know that when I look at you, I see my future. A sob bubbled in her throat. Nicholas. He smiled softly. I love you, Elena, and I'll wait for as long as it takes. She stared at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, at the raw vulnerability in his voice. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. Maybe this wasn't the life she had planned. Maybe this wasn't how love was supposed to happen. But as she looked at the man kneeling before her, offering her his heart, She realized something. Sometimes, the best things in life were the ones you never saw coming. The morning after Nicholas's shocking proposal, Elena woke up to a world that had already changed. She wasn't ready for it. The moment she turned on her phone, she was bombarded with notifications. Dozens of missed calls, countless messages, and headlines that sent a jolt of panic straight through her chest. Billionaire Nicholas Sterling proposes to a mystery woman. Who is she? From rags to riches? Taxi driver's secret identity revealed. The woman who stole a billionaire's heart, but can she handle his world? Her hands trembled as she scrolled through article after article, each one dissecting her life, her past, and her connection to Nicholas. Photos of them together were everywhere, captured moments from their time on the island, blurry images of her stepping into his car, grainy shots of them at dinner. Some of the articles speculated that she was a gold digger, others called her an opportunist, and some, though rare, painted her as a Cinderella figure, a woman who had captured the heart of a billionaire in an unlikely love story. But none of them told the real story. None of them knew the truth about how they met, how they fell for each other. The headlines felt like knives slicing into her, each one twisting her identity into something unrecognizable. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't prepared for it. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. "Elena?" Nicholas's voice was firm but gentle. "Open the door." She hesitated before slowly pulling it open. The moment she saw his face, the worry in his eyes, the tightness in his jaw, she knew he had seen it too. "It's bad, isn't it?" she whispered. His expression darkened. "It's a lot." He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "I knew the media would react, but I didn't think it would be this fast. They're everywhere." Elena swallowed hard. "I don't know how to handle this." He reached for her hands, gripping them tightly. "You don't have to. I will." "But how? How could anyone control a storm like this?" "Nicholas, they're tearing me apart," she admitted, her voice shaking. "They think I'm using you, that I was after your money all along." His grip tightened. "Do you care what they think?" She hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "I care about what this will do to us." His gaze softened, and he pulled her into his arms. "We'll get through it." But even as he said it, the weight of the world pressed down on them. That afternoon, Nicholas had a press conference scheduled. His PR team had advised him to get ahead of the rumors, to control the narrative before it spiraled further out of control. Elena didn't want him to go alone. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as they stood outside the press conference venue, dozens of reporters waiting beyond the glass doors. "I'm sure," he said firmly, "but you don't have to come in if you don't want to." She took a shaky breath. "I want to." When they stepped inside, camera flashes exploded like fireworks. The noise was deafening. Shouted questions, accusations, demands for answers. Nicholas remained calm, his grip on Elena's hand never wavering as they took their seats at the podium. A reporter stood first. "Mr. Sterling, is it true that Elena was a taxi driver before she met you?" Nicholas's jaw clenched. "Her job has nothing to do with the fact that I love her." Another reporter jumped in. "Is she after your money?" "No," he said sharply. "And anyone who knew her would understand that." "Then why keep the relationship a secret? Why did you let the world believe you were just another working-class man?" Nicholas exhaled slowly, then met the reporter's gaze head-on. "Because for once in my life, I wanted to be seen as a person. Not a billionaire, not a CEO, just a man. And Elena saw me that way before she knew anything about my wealth. That's why I love her. That's why I proposed." The room went silent for a moment before another reporter fired a question at Elena. "And what about you, Miss Torres? How do you respond to the claims that you're a gold digger?" Every muscle in her body tensed. This was the moment. The moment the world would judge her. But then she felt Nicholas's hand squeeze hers, grounding her. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and spoke. "I fell for Nicholas when I thought he was just a taxi driver," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "And if he lost every penny tomorrow, I'd still choose him. A murmur ran through the room. Another reporter leaned forward. "So you're saying the money means nothing to you?" "It means nothing," she said honestly. "I didn't fall in love with his bank account. I fell in love with the man who made me laugh when I was having a bad day. The man who listens when I speak, who sees me for who I am. The money, that's just background noise." Nicholas turned to look at her then, his eyes shining with something she couldn't quite name. Pride? Admiration? Love? The press conference lasted another 20 minutes, filled with more questions, more scrutiny. But by the end of it, one thing was clear. Nicholas wasn't backing down, and neither was she. That night, they sat together in his penthouse, watching as the news replayed clips from the conference. Some outlets praised them, calling it a modern fairy tale. Others continued to speculate, to twist their words. But at the end of the day, none of it mattered. Because when Nicholas turned to her and whispered, "I meant every word," she knew the truth. They were in this together. And nothing, no scandal, no headlines, no rumors, could change that. The world had calmed down, at least a little. The media storm that had once felt overwhelming had slowly started to die down, replaced by newer scandals and fresh headlines that had nothing to do with Elena and Nicholas. But the effects of it still lingered. People still recognized Elena on the street. Some whispered, some congratulated her, and others sneered, their jealousy or judgment clear in their eyes. But she had learned to ignore it, to focus on what really mattered, her future with Nicholas. And that future was starting now. "Are you ready?" Nicholas asked as he placed the keys in her hand. She looked at him, her heart pounding. "For what?" "For a fresh start," he said with a small smile. Elena took a deep breath before turning the key and stepping into their new home. It wasn't what she had expected. Not a massive, sprawling mansion with servants and cold, empty rooms. Instead, it was warm, inviting. A modern yet cozy space that felt like it had been designed for them, not just for show. Large windows let in golden sunlight, illuminating the sleek but comfortable furniture. A fireplace crackled softly in the living room, and in the center of it all was the man she loved, watching her with quiet anticipation. "You bought this for us?" she whispered. Nicholas nodded. "I wanted a place where we could just be us. No press, no expectations, just home. Home." The word settled into her chest, filling a space she hadn't realized was empty. For so long, she had drifted through life, never feeling like she truly belonged anywhere. But standing here, with Nicholas beside her, she finally understood. Home wasn't a place. It was a feeling. And she had found it, with him. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a rhythm. Mornings were filled with laughter as they navigated the little quirks of living together. Elena stealing the blankets, Nicholas leaving his socks everywhere, their playful arguments over what to watch on TV. It was normal, it was real, and it was perfect in its own way. But life wasn't a fairy tale, and Elena knew that reality had a way of creeping back in. One evening, as they sat on the couch, Nicholas glanced at her, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "There's something I've been thinking about," he said carefully, "and I want your honest opinion." Elena set down her tea. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "I've been running my company the same way for years. But after everything that's happened, I'm starting to wonder, am I really making a difference? Or am I just another billionaire sitting in an office, disconnected from the world?" She studied him, sensing the depth of his conflict. Nicholas had everything, money, power, influence. But she could see that it wasn't enough for him. He wanted more, not in wealth, but in purpose. "What do you want to do?" she asked softly. He hesitated before answering. "I want to use what I have to help people. To create something meaningful." Her heart swelled with pride. This was the man she had fallen in love with. Not just a billionaire, but a man with a heart, with a desire to do good. "Then let's do it," she said without hesitation. His brow lifted. "You'd be okay with that? With stepping into something new?" "Nicholas," she said firmly, taking his hand. "I fell in love with you, not your bank account. Whatever path you choose, I'm walking it with you. A slow smile spread across his lips, and in that moment, she saw it. The future they were building, brick by brick, choice by choice. They spent the next few months restructuring Nicholas's company, redirecting resources to charities, investing in projects that truly mattered. And Elena found herself becoming more involved than she ever imagined. She didn't just stand beside Nicholas, she became his partner in every sense, helping him with outreach, sitting in on meetings, offering insights that no one else had. The board members were skeptical at first. "With all due respect, Mr. Sterling, what does Miss Torres know about running a corporation?" one of them had asked during a meeting. Nicholas had simply leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "She knows what it's like to struggle. She knows what it means to work hard without a safety net, and that makes her more qualified than half the people in this room." The silence that followed had been deafening, but Nicholas didn't waver, and neither did Elena. Together they built something new, a company that wasn't just about profit, but about people, a company that reflected the values they both believed in. And slowly, the world began to see Elena not as the woman who had trapped a billionaire, but as a force of her own. Interviews started shifting, less about her past, and more about her vision. People respected her, admired her, and most importantly, Nicholas never let her doubt her worth. "You belong here," he told her one night as they stood on the balcony, looking over the city they were changing. "With me. In this life." She smiled, leaning against him. "I know." Their future wasn't perfect. There were challenges and obstacles they would have to overcome, but they weren't afraid, because they had each other. And that was enough. Elena and Nicholas had proven that love wasn't about wealth or status. It was about trust, growth, and standing by each other even when the world doubted them. Their journey had been filled with unexpected turns, challenges that tested their bond, and moments of deep reflection. But in the end, they had built something real, something lasting. And now, their story serves as a reminder that sometimes, love finds you in the most unexpected ways. But what about you? What do you believe about love, fate, and second chances? Do you think true love can overcome class differences and social expectations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another captivating love story. There are so many more incredible tales waiting to be told, stories of passion, heartbreak, redemption, and the power of love to change lives. Stay with us on this journey and let's keep discovering love in all its forms, one story at a time.